Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture beyond the city lights into the forgotten corners of rural America with 8 chilling accounts that prove isolation breeds the darkest secrets. In this episode we will journey through remote farmlands, abandoned backroads, and forgotten homesteads with 8 harrowing tales of countryside terror drawn from the authentic experiences of those who survived to share their stories. Each narrative has been meticulously documented from first-hand testimonies of individuals who witnessed horrors hidden in plain sight across America's heartland. To protect the identities of those brave enough to come forward, certain names and specific locations have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for spine-chilling true horror content that exposes the darkness lurking in unexpected places. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the buried truths that others fear to speak. Drop a comment below and let us know which type of rural horror story disturbs you most, and do not forget to share your own countryside encounters if you dare. Now let us begin our descent into the isolated terror that awaits beyond the last streetlight. So this is actually my late grandfather's story, but I found his journal after we cleared out the old farmhouse. The entry was dated October 15, 1987, and it started with, "The Kowalski place has been empty for 3 years, but someone's been lighting fires in their kitchen every night this week." I never knew my grandfather kept a journal until we found it tucked inside his old tool chest, wrapped in plastic like it was some kind of treasure he needed to protect. My grandmother had passed 5 years earlier, and when we went through their belongings, most of it was just the usual stuff you'd expect from people who lived through the Depression. But this journal, this changed everything I thought I knew about the quiet man who taught me how to fix engines and never talked about his past. The Kowalski place sat about 2 miles down the gravel road from my grandparents' ranch, separated by nothing but rolling hills and barbed wire fencing that had seen better decades. According to what I learned from my grandmother years later, the Kowalskis had been decent neighbors for about 15 years. They kept to themselves mostly, raised a few head of cattle, and Mrs. Kowalski would bring over fresh bread every Christmas morning. Then one day in 1984, they just packed up and left. No goodbye, no forwarding address, just an empty house with the windows boarded up and weeds starting to claim the front porch. My grandfather wrote in his journal that he'd been noticing strange lights coming from the abandoned house for about a week before he decided to investigate. He described the lights as orange and flickering, definitely from the kitchen window, and they would appear every night around 9 o'clock and burn until sometime after midnight. He wrote that he'd mentioned it to my grandmother, but she insisted it was probably just teenagers using the place to party, or maybe someone passing through looking for shelter. But my grandfather had a different feeling about it, something that made his stomach turn every time he saw those lights dancing behind the dirty glass. On October 16th, the day after that first entry, my grandfather wrote that he'd walked over to the Kowalski place in broad daylight to get a better look. He brought his rifle, not because he was looking for trouble, but because out there in Wyoming you just never knew what kind of wildlife might have taken up residence in an abandoned building. When he got close to the house, he could smell something that reminded him of his time in Vietnam. Something he described as the smell of meat left too long in the sun but sweeter, like someone had tried to cover it up with perfume. The front door was still boarded up, but my grandfather noticed that the boards over the kitchen window had been removed and stacked neatly beside the house. The window itself was clean, cleaner than it had any right to be after 3 years of Wyoming weather. He wrote that he could see into the kitchen from where he stood, and everything looked exactly like the Kowalskis had left it. The table was still set for 2, with plates and silverware waiting for a meal that would never come. The old wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and my grandfather could see fresh ashes in the firebox, still warm to the touch when he reached through the window to check. That night, my grandfather positioned himself in his own kitchen with a pair of binoculars and waited. At exactly 9:15, the lights appeared again, but this time he could see more than just the flickering glow. According to his journal entry from October 17th, he watched two figures moving around the Kowalski kitchen, and they were definitely not teenagers or drifters looking for shelter. He described them as a man and a woman, both dressed in what looked like the same clothes the Kowalskis used to wear. The man had on overalls and a flannel shirt, while the woman wore a simple dress with an apron tied around her waist. My grandfather wrote that he watched them for over an hour, and they seemed to be going through the motions of preparing and eating dinner. They would sit at the table, lift forks to their mouths, and even appear to be having conversation. But something about their movement seemed wrong to him. He described it as watching actors who had forgotten their lines, going through the motions of a play they barely remembered. The strangest part was that he never saw them actually eat anything, despite the fact that they spent the entire time making the gestures of people sharing a meal. The next few journal entries document my grandfather's growing obsession with the lights in the Kowalski house. He started timing their appearances, noting that they showed up at exactly the same time every night and lasted for exactly the same duration. He also started paying attention to other details that he'd initially missed. The figures never seemed to acknowledge the outside world, never looked toward the windows, or acted like they were aware that anyone might be watching them. They also never seemed to bring any food into the house or take any dishes away when they finished their nightly routine. On October 22nd, my grandfather decided to get a closer look. He wrote that he'd been losing sleep over the whole situation and needed to know what was really happening in that kitchen. He waited until the figures appeared at their usual time, then crept across the field between the two properties, staying low and moving slowly to avoid being seen. When he got close enough to peer directly through the kitchen window, what he saw made him question his own sanity. The man and woman were sitting at the table just like he'd observed through his binoculars, but up close he could see that their faces were wrong. My grandfather struggled to describe exactly what he meant by this, but he wrote that their features seemed blurred, like someone had smudged a photograph before it dried. Their eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible portion. And when they moved their mouths as if speaking, no sound came out. Most disturbing of all, my grandfather could see that the plates in front of them held nothing but what looked like small piles of dirt and dead insects. My grandfather wrote that he watched in horror as the woman picked up a fork, stabbed it into the pile of dirt on her plate and brought it to her mouth. She chewed methodically, dirt falling from the corners of her lips, while the man did the same with what appeared to be a collection of dead beetles and moths. They ate in complete silence, never acknowledging each other or showing any sign that they were aware of my grandfather's presence just outside their window. The journal entry from October 23rd reveals that my grandfather had barely slept the night before, and he'd started to wonder if he was having some kind of breakdown. He wrote that he'd considered talking to someone about what he'd seen, but he knew how crazy it would sound. Instead, he decided to document everything as carefully as possible, hoping that writing it down would help him make sense of the situation, or at least provide evidence if anyone ever questioned his mental state. That night, my grandfather returned to his observation post in his own kitchen, but this time he brought a camera. He'd managed to borrow a telephoto lens from a friend in town, and he was determined to get photographic evidence of whatever was happening in the Kowalski house. At exactly 9:15, the lights appeared as usual, and my grandfather started taking pictures. Through the camera lens, he could see the two figures more clearly than ever before. And what he saw convinced him that whatever was happening in that house had nothing to do with the living world. The figures moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, like marionettes being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how puppets were supposed to work. Their heads would snap from side to side at odd angles, and sometimes they would freeze in the middle of an action for several seconds before continuing. Most disturbing of all, my grandfather noticed that they cast no shadows, despite the fact that the kitchen was lit by what appeared to be candlelight from several sources. On October 25th, my grandfather wrote that he'd developed the photographs he'd taken and they showed nothing but an empty kitchen. The lights were visible in the pictures, but the figures he'd been watching night after night simply weren't there. This discovery sent him into what he described as a spiral of doubt and fear that lasted for several days. He questioned whether he was losing his mind, whether the isolation of ranch life had finally gotten to him, or whether he was experiencing some kind of delayed reaction to his experiences in Vietnam. But then, on October 30th, something happened that convinced my grandfather that whatever he'd been seeing was real, even if the camera couldn't capture it. He wrote that he'd been awakened at around 3 in the morning by the sound of knocking at his front door. When he looked outside, he saw the same 2 figures from the Kowalski house standing on his porch. They looked exactly as they had in the abandoned kitchen, complete with the blurred features and completely black eyes. But now they were at his door, apparently wanting to come inside. My grandfather wrote that he stood frozen in his hallway, afraid to make any sound that might alert the figures to his presence. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Between the knocks, my grandfather could hear what sounded like whispered conversation, but the words were in a language he didn't recognize, something that sounded like a combination of static and wind through dead trees. The journal entry from October 31st, the last one my grandfather ever wrote about the Kowalski house, describes how he spent the entire night huddled in his bedroom closet with his rifle across his knees. The knocking had stopped sometime around dawn, and when he finally worked up the courage to look outside, the figures were gone. But they'd left something behind that made my grandfather pack up his things and drive into town to stay with friends for the next 2 weeks. Someone had arranged small piles of dirt and dead insects on his front porch. Dozens of them, each one carefully placed in a perfect circle around his door. The dirt looked like it had been scraped from a grave, dark and rich and full of things that my grandfather didn't want to identify. The insects were all the same types he'd seen the figures eating in the Kowalski kitchen, beetles and moths and other creatures that looked like they'd been dead for months. The final entry in my grandfather's journal, dated November 15th, simply says, "The lights in the Kowalski house have stopped. I hope they've moved on to wherever they belong, but I have a feeling they'll be back someday, and next time they might not be content to just knock on the door." My grandfather never wrote another word about the Kowalski house, but he never went back to his ranch either. He sold the property 6 months later and moved into town, where he lived until his death 15 years ago. When I asked my grandmother about why they'd left the ranch so suddenly, she always said it was because my grandfather had gotten too old for the isolation and hard work. But after finding his journal, I realized she'd been protecting a secret that was too strange and terrifying for most people to accept. Last year, I drove out to where the old ranch used to be just to see what had become of the place. The house my grandparents lived in has been torn down, but the Kowalski place is still standing and it's still empty. The current landowner told me that he's tried to rent it out several times over the years, but tenants never stay more than a few weeks. They all complain about strange lights in the kitchen and the sound of knocking at their doors in the middle of the night. I didn't tell him what I'd read in my grandfather's journal, but I made sure to visit the property during daylight hours. Even in the bright Wyoming sunshine, the Kowalski house felt wrong somehow, like a place where something terrible had happened and never quite finished happening. I didn't stick around to see if the lights still appear at 9:15 every night, but I have a feeling that some things never really leave. They just wait patiently for the next person who's curious enough to look too closely. The strangest part of my grandfather's story isn't the supernatural elements or the unexplained phenomena. It's the fact that a man who survived combat in Vietnam and spent 40 years working a ranch in one of the most isolated parts of America could be driven from his home by something he couldn't fight or understand. Whatever those figures were, whatever they wanted, it was enough to convince a tough, practical man that some battles aren't worth fighting, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. I am going to tell you exactly what I told Sheriff Morrison that night in November 2019, word for word, because I have gone over it 1,000 times in my head. Sheriff, you asked me why I will not let my kids go to any Halloween activities. Well, let me tell you about what happened when I was 12 years old at the Brennan family corn maze. This was back in October 1995, and the Brennan farm was about 15 miles outside of our little town of Clearwater. Population 837 if you counted the Hendricks twins who lived in that trailer behind the grain elevator. The Brennans had been running their corn maze for maybe 3 years at that point, and it had become the biggest Halloween attraction for 50 miles in any direction. Kids would come from as far away as North Platte just to get lost in their maze and scared by whatever surprises they had waiting in there. Now you have to understand something about rural Nebraska in the 90s. There was not much for kids to do, especially in October when the weather started turning cold and the days got shorter. We had already been through all the good fishing spots, we had ridden our bikes down every gravel road worth exploring, and most of us were too young to be interested in the kinds of trouble that the high school kids got into. So when the Brennan corn maze opened up each year, it was like Christmas morning for every kid in 3 counties. My best friend at the time was a kid named Danny Kowalczyk, and his older brother Marcus was supposed to take us to the maze that Saturday afternoon. But Marcus came down with some kind of stomach bug, or at least that is what he told his mother. I suspect he was just hungover from whatever he and his buddies had been drinking the night before. But Mrs. Kowalczyk believed him and told Danny that we would have to wait until the following weekend to go to the maze. Well, Danny was not having any of that. He had been talking about the corn maze for weeks, and he had already bragged to half our class that he was going to be the first kid to make it through without getting scared. So he came up with what seemed like a perfectly reasonable plan at the time. We would ride our bikes out to the Brennan farm on our own, pay the $5 admission fee, go through the maze, and be back home before dark. What could possibly go wrong? I should have known something was off when we got to the farm and saw how few cars were in the parking area. Usually the place would be packed on a Saturday afternoon, especially this close to Halloween. But there were maybe 6 or 7 vehicles there, mostly pickup trucks that belonged to local families. The Brennan farmhouse looked the same as always. White clapboard siding with green shutters and a wraparound porch decorated with pumpkins and corn stalks. But something about the whole scene felt different, quieter somehow. Mrs. Brennan was sitting at a card table near the entrance to the maze, just like she did every year. She was a pleasant woman in her 50s with graying hair and a friendly smile, the kind of person who would send you home with a plate of cookies if you helped her carry in groceries. But when we walked up to pay our admission, she looked at us with what I can only describe as concern. She asked us where our parents were, and when we told her that we had ridden our bikes out there by ourselves, she shook her head and said that maybe we should come back another day with adult supervision. Danny started to argue with her, saying that we were old enough to handle a corn maze and that we had been looking forward to this for weeks. I could see Mrs. Brennan wavering, probably remembering when she was 12 and desperate for some excitement. Finally, she sighed and took our $10, but she made us promise that we would stick together no matter what happened in the maze. She also gave us each a whistle and told us to blow them if we got separated. or if we needed help for any reason. At the time, I thought she was just being overly cautious, the way adults always seem to be when kids wanted to have any real fun. Looking back, I realized she was trying to protect us from something she knew was waiting in that maze. The entrance to the corn maze was marked by 2 tall posts with a wooden sign that read Brennan Family Corn Maze, Enter at your own risk. The corn stalks on either side of the entrance were easily 8 feet tall, thick and healthy from what had been a good growing season. Once you stepped between those posts, the world outside the maze just disappeared. All you could see was corn in every direction, and all you could hear was the rustling of the stalks in the October wind. Danny immediately took charge, declaring that he had studied maps of corn mazes online and knew the secret to getting through them quickly. His strategy was to always turn right when we came to a dead end, which he claimed would eventually lead us to the center of the maze and then back out again. I had no better plan, so I followed him as we started making our way through the narrow pathways between the corn rows. The first 15 or 20 minutes were exactly what you would expect from a corn maze. We hit a few dead ends, backtracked, tried different routes, and gradually worked our way deeper into the maze. We could hear other people somewhere else in the maze, voices echoing off the corn stalks, but we never saw anyone. The pathways were wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and the corn was so thick that you could not see more than a few feet in any direction. That is when we started finding the scarecrows. The first one was just a traditional scarecrow, the kind you might see in any cornfield. It was made from old clothes stuffed with straw, with a burlap sack for a head and a floppy hat. But there was something about the way it was positioned that made both of us stop and stare. Instead of being mounted on a post, like a normal scarecrow, this one was sitting on a wooden chair that had been placed right in the middle of the pathway. Its head was tilted to one side like it was listening to something, and its straw-stuffed arms were positioned like it was reaching for whoever might walk by. Danny laughed and said that the Brennans were really going all out with their decorations this year. He walked right up to the scarecrow and poked it in the chest, making jokes about how realistic it looked. But I noticed that the clothes the scarecrow was wearing were not the usual old work clothes you would expect. This scarecrow was wearing a relatively new flannel shirt and blue jeans that looked like they had been worn recently. The boots on its feet were muddy, like someone had been walking around the farm in them just that morning. We took a few pictures with Danny's disposable camera and continued deeper into the maze. But the further we went, the more scarecrows we encountered, and each one was stranger than the last. The second one we found was standing at a crossroads where 4 pathways met, and it was pointing down one of the paths like it was giving directions. This one was wearing a woman's dress and had long brown hair that looked suspiciously real hanging down from under its floppy hat. The third scarecrow was the one that made me start feeling really uncomfortable. It was positioned around a corner in such a way that you would almost walk right into it before you saw it. This one was wearing a Letterman jacket from our high school, and the name stitched on the front read, Kawaltsiki. Danny went pale when he saw it because his older brother Marcus had a jacket just like that one. In fact, Danny was pretty sure this was Marcus's jacket, which should have been hanging in his bedroom closet back home. We spent about 10 minutes examining that scarecrow, trying to figure out how the Brennans could have gotten hold of Marcus's jacket. The only explanation we could come up with was that Marcus had somehow loaned it to them for their Halloween display, but that did not make any sense. Marcus was proud of that jacket and protective of it. He would never let anyone else wear it, much less use it to dress up a scarecrow. Danny tried to pull the jacket off the scarecrow to get a better look at it, but it seemed to be attached somehow. The more he tugged at it, the more agitated he became, and finally he started yelling at the scarecrow, demanding to know how it had gotten his brother's jacket. That is when I noticed that the scarecrow's head had shifted slightly, like it was turning to look at Danny while he yelled. I told Danny that we should leave the jacket alone and keep moving through the maze, but he was fixated on it. He was convinced that someone had stolen the jacket from his house and was using it to mess with us. He started talking about how we should find whoever was in charge of the maze and demand an explanation. But when he tried to use the whistle that Mrs. Brennan had given us, it would not make any sound. He blew as hard as he could, but nothing came out. That is when we heard the laughter. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the maze, a low chuckling sound that seemed to echo off the cornstalks from multiple directions at once. It did not sound like the kind of laughter you would hear from other visitors having fun in the maze. This was darker, more menacing, like someone was laughing at a joke that we were not in on. Danny and I looked at each other, and I could see that he was starting to get scared too. We decided to abandon his right turn strategy and just focus on finding our way out of the maze as quickly as possible. But no matter which direction we went, we seemed to keep running into more scarecrows. They were everywhere now, positioned at every turn and crossroads. Some were sitting, some were standing, and some were posed in ways that made them look like they were dancing or playing games with each other. The worst part was that they were all wearing clothes that looked familiar. One was wearing a dress that I was pretty sure belonged to my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson. Another was wearing a sheriff's uniform that looked exactly like the one Sheriff Morrison wore, complete with the badge and nameplate. There was even one wearing the same type of overalls that my grandfather always wore when he worked in his garden. As we got deeper into the maze, the scarecrows started looking more and more realistic. Their faces, which had been simple burlap sacks with painted features near the entrance, were now much more detailed. Some had faces that looked almost human, with realistic eyes and mouths that seemed to be smiling or frowning. One scarecrow that we passed had eyes that I swear followed us as we walked by. Danny was getting increasingly frantic, turning down pathways at random and sometimes doubling back when he realized we had been down the same route before. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky, and the shadows between the cornstalks were getting longer and darker. We had been in the maze for over an hour, and we were no closer to finding the exit than when we had started. That is when we found the scarecrow that was wearing Danny's clothes. It was sitting on a wooden stump in a small clearing, wearing the exact same red t-shirt and blue jeans that Danny had on. The same sneakers, the same baseball cap, even the same digital watch that his parents had given him for his birthday. But the most disturbing thing was the face. Instead of a burlap sack, this scarecrow had a face that looked exactly like Danny's, down to the freckles on his nose and the small scar on his chin from when he had fallen off his bike the previous summer. Danny started screaming when he saw it, not yelling or shouting, but actual screaming, the kind of sound you make when you are absolutely terrified and your mind cannot process what you are seeing. He grabbed my arm and started pulling me away from the scarecrow. But no matter which direction we went, we kept ending up back in the same clearing with the same scarecrow wearing his face. That is when I realized that we were not alone in the clearing. There were other people there, standing motionless between the cornstalks like they were part of the maze decorations. At first I thought they were just more scarecrows, but then I noticed that they were breathing. They were real people, but they were standing perfectly still with their arms at their sides and their eyes staring straight ahead. I recognized some of them. There was Tommy Richardson, who had graduated from our high school 3 years earlier and then disappeared one day without telling anyone where he was going. There was Mrs. Henderson, who used to run the post office before she had stopped showing up to work the previous spring. There was even Marcus Kowalczyk, Danny's older brother, wearing the same clothes he had been wearing when he said he was too sick to take us to the maze. They were all just standing there, not moving, not talking, not even blinking. But they were alive. I could see their chests rising and falling as they breathed, and occasionally one of them would twitch slightly, like they were trying to move but could not quite manage it. Danny was calling his brother's name, begging him to respond, but Marcus just stood there staring at nothing. That is when the man appeared. He stepped out from between the cornstalks like he had been waiting there for us to find him. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that seemed to blend with the shadows between the corn rows. His face was pale and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. But the most disturbing thing about him was his smile. He had the kind of smile that you might see on someone who had just heard the funniest joke in the world. Except there was nothing funny about our situation. He told us that we were the guests of honor at his harvest festival, and that we should feel privileged to be chosen for such a special role. He explained that every year he selected a few special visitors to join his collection, people who would help him tend to his maze and make it more interesting for future guests. The scarecrows, he said, were just the beginning. The real magic happened when he found people who were willing to become permanent residents of his maze. Danny asked him what he had done to his brother, and the man laughed, that same chuckling sound we had heard earlier. He said that Marcus was perfectly safe and that he was simply learning to appreciate the simple pleasures of country life. All of his new residents, he explained, discovered that there was great peace to be found in standing still and letting the world move around them. They no longer had to worry about jobs or relationships or any of the complicated problems of modern life. I grabbed Danny's hand and we ran. We did not have any plan or strategy. We just ran as fast as we could through the corn maze, taking turns at random and hoping that we would somehow find our way out. Behind us, we could hear the man laughing and calling after us, telling us that we could not leave the maze until he gave us permission. He said that the maze would keep us there as long as he wanted, and that eventually we would get tired and have to stop running. But we did not stop. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they were going to collapse. And somehow, miraculously, we found ourselves back at the entrance where Mrs. Brennan was still sitting at her card table. She looked up at us with a sad expression, like she had been expecting us to come running out of the maze in exactly this condition. She did not ask us what had happened or why we looked so terrified. She just told us to get on our bikes and ride straight home and to never come back to the maze again. She also made us promise that we would not tell anyone what we had seen in there because no one would believe us and it would only cause trouble for everyone involved. We rode our bikes home as fast as we could, and I have never ridden past the Brennan farm since then. Danny and I never talked about what happened that day, not even to each other. When people asked us how the corn maze was, we just said it was fine and changed the subject. When Danny's parents asked him where Marcus was, he told them that Marcus had said he was going to spend the night at a friend's house. Marcus never came home. His parents filed a missing person report and the sheriff organized search parties, but they never found any trace of him. The official explanation was that he had run away from home, maybe to join the military or find work in a bigger city. His parents eventually stopped talking about him, and after a few years, it was like he had never existed at all. The Brennan family stopped running their corn maze after that year. Mrs. Brennan told people that they were getting too old to maintain it properly, and that the insurance costs were getting too high. The cornfield where the maze used to be was planted with soybeans the following spring, and it has been soybeans ever since. But sometimes when I drive past the Brennan farm on my way to the grain elevator, I can see people standing in that soybean field. They are too far away for me to recognize their faces, but they are just standing there motionless, like they are waiting for something. And sometimes when the wind is blowing just right, I can hear that same chuckling laughter that we heard in the maze. That is why I will not let my kids go to Halloween activities, Sheriff Morrison. Because I know that there are things out there that use our celebrations and traditions as hunting grounds. They use our desire for fun and excitement to lure us into situations where we become vulnerable. and once they have you, they do not let you go. Danny Kowalczyk moved away from Clearwater the day after he graduated from high school. He left town without saying goodbye to anyone, including me, and I have not heard from him since. But I understand why he had to leave. Some experiences change you in ways that make it impossible to stay in the place where they happened. I stayed in Clearwater because this is my home, and because I feel like I have a responsibility to make sure that what happened to us does not happen to other kids. Every Halloween, I make sure to drive past every farm and rural attraction in the county just to see if there are any new corn mazes or haunted attractions that might be more than they appear to be. So far, everything has been normal. Just regular families trying to make a little extra money during the Halloween season, with regular decorations and regular scares. But I keep watching, because I know that someday something like the Brennan Maze might appear again. And when it does, I want to be ready to warn people before they make the same mistake that Danny and I made that October afternoon in 1995. That is my statement, Sheriff Morrison. I know it sounds crazy, and I know you probably think I am making it all up or that I misremembered what happened when I was a kid. But I am telling you the absolute truth, and I will swear to it on a stack of Bibles if you want me to. There are things in this world that use our own celebrations against us, and we ignore them at our own peril. Being a mail carrier in rural Kentucky means you see things that aren't meant to be seen. Most days it's just elderly folks excited for their Social Security checks. But Route 47 had one address that made my skin crawl every time I had to drive down that gravel road. The mailbox said Hendricks, but I'm pretty sure whatever lived in that house wasn't human. I started working for the Postal Service in 2019, fresh out of college with a degree I couldn't use and student loans I couldn't ignore. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and got me out of the apartment I was sharing with two roommates who thought hygiene was optional. Rural mail delivery seemed like it would be peaceful, maybe even therapeutic, driving through the beautiful Kentucky countryside, delivering letters and packages to people who were genuinely happy to see you. My route covered about 60 square miles of some of the most isolated farmland and forested hills in eastern Kentucky. The kind of place where your GPS gives up and you have to rely on handwritten directions from the postmaster. Most of my stops were at the end of long dirt driveways, serving families who had been living on the same land for generations. They were good people, the kind who would invite you in for sweet tea and ask about your family like they had known you all your life. But the Hendricks place was different from the very first day I had to deliver mail there. The mailbox sat at the end of a gravel road that curved up into the hills, disappearing behind a thick stand of pine trees that blocked any view of the house from the main road. The mailbox itself was newer than most of the others on my route, painted bright red with Hendricks, stenciled in black letters across the side. But there was something about it that felt wrong, like someone had tried too hard to make it look normal. The first time I drove up that gravel road to deliver a package that wouldn't fit in the mailbox, I got about halfway to the house before I started feeling sick to my stomach. It wasn't motion sickness from the winding road or anything like that. It was a deep, primitive kind of fear that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and my hands shake on the steering wheel. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get away from that place as fast as possible. But I needed the job, and leaving mail undelivered was a good way to lose it. So I kept driving up that gravel road even though my heart was pounding and I was starting to sweat despite the cool October weather. The trees on either side of the road were dense and dark, creating a tunnel effect that made it feel like I was driving deeper underground instead of up into the hills. When I finally reached the clearing where the house sat, what I saw made me question whether I was losing my mind. The house itself looked normal enough, a single-story ranch-style building with vinyl siding and a metal roof. but there were things scattered around the yard that didn't belong in any normal residential setting. There were dozens of metal stakes driven into the ground in perfect geometric patterns, each one about 3 feet tall with something tied to the top that looked like strips of fabric or paper fluttering in the wind. The front yard was divided into sections by what looked like surveyor's tape stretched between wooden posts, creating a grid pattern that extended from the house to the edge of the tree line. Each section contained something different. One had what appeared to be animal bones arranged in circles. Another had pieces of broken mirror stuck into the ground at regular intervals, reflecting the sunlight in harsh, painful flashes. A third section was completely bare except for dark stains in the soil that looked suspiciously like dried blood. I sat in my mail truck for several minutes trying to decide whether I should deliver the package or just mark it as undeliverable and drive away. That's when I noticed that someone was watching me from the house. There was a figure standing at one of the windows, perfectly still, and even from 50 feet away I could tell that whoever it was wasn't moving at all, not even to breathe. They just stood there staring at my truck with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I decided to compromise. I would walk to the front door, leave the package, and get out of there as quickly as possible. But as I walked across that bizarre front yard, stepping carefully around the stakes and tape and mirror fragments, I started noticing details that made the whole situation even more disturbing. The strips of fabric tied to the stakes weren't fabric at all. They were pieces of clothing, children's clothing, faded and weathered like they had been hanging there for years. The bones in the circles weren't from the kinds of animals you would expect to find on a rural Kentucky farm. Some of them were too small to be from cattle or pigs, but too large to be from chickens or rabbits. And they were arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, like someone had been using them for some kind of ceremony or sacrifice. When I got to the front door, I could hear sounds coming from inside the house that didn't make any sense. There was a rhythmic tapping like someone hammering nails, but it was too fast and too regular to be any kind of normal construction work. Underneath that was a low humming sound, like machinery running. But it had an organic quality that made me think of insects or maybe even human voices. I left the package by the door and walked back to my truck as quickly as I could without running. The figure in the window never moved, never acknowledged my presence, just continued staring with that unblinking intensity. As I drove back down the gravel road, I checked my rearview mirror and saw that the figure had moved to a different window, one that gave them a better view of the road. They were still there, still staring, when I reached the main road and they disappeared behind the trees. That night I called my supervisor and asked if there was anything unusual about the Hendricks address that I should know about. He said he'd never heard anything strange about them, but the previous mail carrier on that route had requested a transfer after only 6 months. When I asked why, he said the guy claimed he was having nightmares about one of the houses on his route, but he never said which one or what the dreams were about. The next delivery to the Hendricks place came 2 weeks later. This time it was just regular mail, so I could leave it in the mailbox without having to drive up to the house. But when I opened the mailbox to put the letters inside, I found something that made me immediately slam it shut and step back. There were dozens of photographs stuffed into the mailbox, all of them showing the same thing. Me. Walking across their front yard, leaving the package, getting back into my truck. Someone had been watching me from multiple locations and taking pictures the entire time I was on their property. The photographs were taken from different angles and distances, suggesting that there had been more than one person watching me, or that someone had moved very quickly between different vantage points while I was delivering the package. Some of the photos were taken from ground level, as if someone had been hiding in the tall grass or behind the trees. Others were taken from above, like someone had been in the trees or on the roof of the house. I should have reported it to the police right then, but I was young and stupid and convinced myself that there had to be some innocent explanation. Maybe they were having problems with theft or vandalism and were documenting everyone who came onto their property. Maybe they were just paranoid about strangers and wanted to keep records for their own protection. I took the photographs with me and threw them away, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end. Every time I had to deliver mail to the Hendricks place after that, there were more photographs in the mailbox. Pictures of me driving up their road, pictures of me walking to their door, pictures of me back at the post office sorting mail, pictures of me at home in my apartment. Someone was following me, documenting my daily routine and using the mail delivery as a way to let me know that they were watching. The photographs got progressively more disturbing. Some showed me sleeping in my bedroom, taken from outside my window. Others showed me grocery shopping, getting gas, visiting friends. There were even pictures of me at places I didn't remember going or doing things I didn't remember doing, like I was being watched constantly and had become so accustomed to the surveillance that I wasn't even aware of it anymore. The worst ones were the pictures that seemed to have been taken from impossible angles or distances. Photos of me from directly overhead, as if someone had been floating in the air above me. Pictures that showed perfect detail of my face and expressions from hundreds of yards away, far beyond what any normal camera lens could accomplish. And there were pictures that showed me in places I had never been, doing things I had never done. But that looked absolutely real and convincing. I finally worked up the courage to drive back up to the Hendricks house and confront whoever was living there. This was a mistake that I still regret making, but at the time I was angry and scared and convinced that a direct confrontation was the only way to make the harassment stop. I drove up that gravel road on a Saturday afternoon when I wouldn't be in my official mail truck and wouldn't be violating any postal service policies. When I got to the clearing where the house sat, I could see immediately that things had changed since my last delivery. The stakes in the yard had been rearranged into different patterns, and there were new additions that made the whole scene even more disturbing. There were mannequins scattered around the property, dressed in mail carrier uniforms that looked exactly like the one I wore to work. Some of the mannequins were positioned like they were walking toward the house. Others were face down in the dirt like they had fallen or been knocked over. One mannequin was hanging from a tree branch by a rope around its neck, spinning slowly in the breeze. It was wearing a name tag that said Delilah in the same font and style as the official Postal Service name tags. When I got closer, I could see that it wasn't just wearing a mail carrier uniform. It was wearing clothes that I recognized as identical to ones in my own closet, down to the specific brand of shoes and the style of watch I wore to work. I walked up to the front door and knocked, ready to demand answers about the photographs and the surveillance and the creepy mannequins. But when the door opened, the person standing there wasn't what I had been expecting. It was a woman in her 50s, pleasant-looking, wearing a floral dress and an apron like she had been cooking dinner. She looked completely normal, like someone's grandmother, not at all like the kind of person who would engage in stalking and harassment. She smiled at me and said that she had been wondering when I would finally come to visit. She invited me in for coffee and said she had something special to show me that she thought I would find very interesting. Against every instinct I had, I followed her into the house, partly because she seemed so normal and harmless, and partly because I was curious about what kind of person could live in a place surrounded by such disturbing displays. The inside of the house was even more disturbing than the outside. Every wall was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same person. Me. Pictures of me from infancy to the present day, including photos that I knew for certain had never been taken. Baby pictures that my own mother didn't have, school photos from years when I had been homeschooled, vacation pictures from trips I had never taken to places I had never been. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Hendricks, explained that she had been documenting my entire life as part of a project she was working on. She said that I had been chosen for this project when I was very young, and that everything I had ever done, every place I had ever been, every person I had ever met, had been carefully planned and arranged to serve the purposes of her research. She showed me filing cabinets full of documents related to my life, report cards from schools I didn't remember attending, medical records from doctors I had never seen, employment records from jobs I had never had. There were detailed charts tracking my daily routines, my relationships, my preferences and habits. There were psychological profiles and behavioral analyses that went back decades, written in the kind of clinical language you would expect to find in a research facility or government laboratory. Mrs. Hendricks explained that I wasn't the first mail carrier to be selected for the project. There had been others before me, and there would be others after me when my part in the research was complete. She showed me photographs of previous mail carriers, all of them young women who looked similar to me, all of them documented in the same obsessive detail throughout their entire lives. When I asked what happened to the previous subjects when their participation in the project was finished, Mrs. Hendricks smiled, that same pleasant grandmother smile, and said that they had moved on to the next phase of the research. She led me to a back room that I immediately wished I had never seen. There were mannequins there too, but these ones weren't wearing uniforms. They were wearing the skin and hair of real people, preserved in some way that made them look almost alive, but not quite right. I ran. I didn't ask any more questions or try to get any more answers. I just ran out of that house and down that gravel road faster than I had ever run in my life. I got in my car and drove straight to the police station, where I tried to explain what I had seen and experienced. But when the officers went to investigate the Hendricks property, they found it completely empty. No house, no mannequins, no strange displays in the yard. Just an empty lot with no signs that anyone had ever lived there. The official explanation was that I had been under stress from my job and had experienced some kind of breakdown or hallucination. The Postal Service transferred me to a different route, and I never had to drive down that gravel road again. But I kept all of the photographs that had been left in the mailbox, and they're all still there, clear evidence that something really happened. I quit the Postal Service 6 months later and moved to a different state. I work in an office now, a nice, safe job where I never have to make deliveries to isolated houses or deal with people who might not be entirely human. But sometimes when I'm checking my mail at my apartment complex, I find photographs that I know I didn't take, showing me in places I don't remember being, doing things I don't remember doing. And sometimes late at night I can hear the sound of gravel crunching outside my window, like someone is walking up a long driveway that doesn't exist, coming to make a delivery that I don't want to receive. The rural countryside might look peaceful and innocent, but there are things living out there in the isolated places that use our routines and our jobs as ways to get close to us, to study us, to add us to their collections. I never found out what Mrs. Hendricks was really researching or why she had chosen me for her project. But I know that there are others out there, other people whose entire lives have been documented and manipulated by forces they don't understand for purposes they can't imagine. The next time you see your mail carrier walking up your driveway, remember that they might be carrying more than just letters and packages. They might be carrying the documentation of your entire existence, compiled by someone who has been watching you far longer than you could ever imagine. I moved to Louisiana in 2020 to study alligator migration patterns for my master's thesis. Local fishermen warned me about night research, said some waters aren't meant to be disturbed after dark. I thought they were just being superstitious until I set up my equipment near Dead Man's Cove and discovered what the gators were really feeding on. When I first arrived in St. Bernard Parish, about 40 miles southeast of New Orleans, I was excited to finally be conducting field research instead of just reading about it in academic journals. My advisor at Tulane had connected me with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and they had given me permission to tag and track alligators in some of the more remote waterways that most researchers avoided because of access issues. The local wildlife office was run by a man named Claude Boudreau, who had been working in the Louisiana wetlands for over 30 years. He was the kind of person who could tell you everything about the ecosystem just by looking at the watercolor and smelling the air. When I explained my research project to him, he was enthusiastic and helpful, offering me the use of a small airboat and giving me detailed maps of the waterways where I was most likely to find the kind of alligator populations I needed for my study. But when I mentioned that I would need to do most of my work at night, since that's when alligators are most active, Claude's demeanor changed completely. He started asking me a lot of questions about exactly where I planned to set up my equipment and whether I had considered doing the research during daylight hours instead. When I insisted that nighttime research was essential for accurate data collection, he reluctantly agreed to help me but made me promise that I would stay in radio contact with his office and that I would never work alone. The area where I was planning to conduct my research was a network of interconnected bayous and marshlands that had been largely untouched by commercial development. It was exactly the kind of pristine habitat that I needed for my study. But it was also incredibly isolated. The nearest road was over 5 miles away, and the only way to reach the research sites was by boat through narrow channels that wound through dense cypress swamps and salt marshes. For the first few weeks, everything went according to plan. I would arrive at my research sites in the late afternoon, set up my equipment before dark, and then spend the night collecting data on alligator behavior and movement patterns. The work was challenging and sometimes uncomfortable, but I was getting excellent data and making good progress toward completing my thesis. The problem started when I decided to expand my research area to include a section of waterway called Dead Man's Cove. According to my maps, this area had the highest concentration of large adult alligators in the entire parish, which made it perfect for my research. But when I mentioned to Claude that I wanted to work in Dead Man's Cove, he immediately tried to talk me out of it. He told me that area had a bad reputation among local fishermen and hunters, and that people who worked there at night sometimes reported seeing and hearing things that couldn't be explained. When I pressed him for more specific information, he said that several people had disappeared in that area over the years and that search teams had never been able to find any trace of them. He suggested that I stick to the research sites that I had already been using, where the alligator populations were almost as dense, but the area was considered safer. But I was a scientist, not a superstitious local fisherman, and I wasn't going to let folklore and ghost stories interfere with my research. Dead Man's Cove represented the best opportunity I had to collect data on large adult alligators, and I wasn't going to pass it up because of some vague warnings about bad things happening at night. So on a humid Tuesday evening in late August, I loaded my equipment into the airboat and headed out to Dead Man's Cove to set up my first night of research in the new location. The area was even more remote and isolated than my previous research sites, accessible only through a narrow channel that wound through miles of cypress swamp before opening up into a large, dark pool of water surrounded by dense marsh grass. The first thing I noticed about Dead Man's Cove was the smell. All of the bayou areas had their own distinctive odors, usually a combination of decaying vegetation, stagnant water, and whatever marine life happened to be in the area. But Dead Man's Cove smelled different, like something large had died in the water and been left to rot. The smell was so strong that I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. The second thing I noticed was the unusual behavior of the wildlife in the area. In my previous research sites, I would usually see and hear a variety of birds, frogs, insects, and other creatures going about their normal nighttime activities. But Dead Man's Cove was eerily quiet. There were no bird calls, no frog croaking, no insect buzzing. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the sides of my boat and the distant splash of what I assumed were alligators moving through the water. I set up my equipment just as the sun was setting, positioning my cameras and sensors at strategic locations around the cove to capture as much alligator activity as possible. According to my preliminary surveys, there should have been at least a dozen large adult alligators in this area, but as the evening progressed, I wasn't seeing nearly as much activity as I had expected. It wasn't until around midnight that I started to realize why the local fishermen had warned me about this place. I was sitting in my boat, monitoring my equipment and taking notes, when I heard what sounded like human voices coming from somewhere across the cove. At first, I thought it might be other researchers or maybe fishermen who were working in the area. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that the voices didn't sound quite right. They were speaking in what might have been English, but the words were distorted and unclear, like someone was trying to talk with their mouth full of water. And there were too many voices, at least a dozen different people all talking at once, but I couldn't see any boats or lights that would indicate the presence of other people in the area. I turned on my high-powered flashlight and swept it across the water in the direction of the voices. But all I could see were the glowing red eyes of alligators reflecting back at me. There were a lot of them, more than I had ever seen in one location, and they were all facing in my direction like they were watching me. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The alligators weren't just floating in the water like they normally do. They were arranged in a perfect circle around something in the center of the cove, and they were all completely motionless. It looked like they were guarding whatever was in the middle of their formation. I used my telephoto camera lens to get a better look at what the alligators were surrounding, and what I saw made me question my own sanity. There were people in the water, at least a dozen of them, standing waist-deep in the dark water in the center of the alligator circle. They were all facing outward toward the alligators, and their mouths were moving like they were speaking, but I was too far away to hear what they were saying. The strangest part was that the people in the water didn't seem to be afraid of the alligators, and the alligators didn't seem to be threatening the people. They were just arranged in this bizarre formation, like they were participating in some kind of ceremony or ritual that I couldn't understand. I tried to get closer to see what was happening, but as soon as I started my boat engine, the entire scene just disappeared. The people in the water sank beneath the surface without making any splash or disturbance, and the alligators scattered in all directions. Within seconds, the cove looked completely normal again. Just dark water and marsh grass, with no sign that anything unusual had been happening. I spent the rest of that night trying to convince myself that I had been hallucinating or that my eyes had been playing tricks on me in the darkness. But when I reviewed the footage from my cameras the next morning, I could clearly see the people standing in the water, surrounded by the circle of alligators. The audio recordings had captured their voices, speaking in that strange, distorted language that didn't quite sound human. Over the next few weeks, I returned to Dead Man's Cove several more times to continue my research, and each time I witnessed similar scenes. Groups of people would appear in the water around midnight, always surrounded by alligators, always speaking in that disturbing waterlogged language. Sometimes there would be more people, sometimes fewer, but they were always there, and they always disappeared as soon as I tried to get closer. I started to recognize some of the faces in the water. One of them looked like a fisherman named Eddie Thibodeau, who had disappeared from the area 3 years earlier. Another looked like a woman named Marie Boudreau, Claude's cousin, who had gone missing while collecting samples for the university environmental lab. A third looked like a teenage boy who had been reported missing from a nearby town the previous summer. The most disturbing realization was that the people in the water all looked exactly the same as they had when they disappeared. They hadn't aged or decomposed or changed in any way. They just stood there in the dark water, speaking their incomprehensible language, while the alligators formed protective circles around them. I tried to research the history of Dead Man's Cove to see if I could find any explanation for what I was witnessing. What I discovered was that people had been disappearing in that area for over a century. Native American tribes had considered the area to be cursed or haunted, and early French settlers had reported similar disappearances. Local records showed that dozens of people had vanished in Dead Man's Cove over the years, and none of them had ever been found. The more I learned about the history of the area, the more I realized that I was witnessing something that had been happening for generations. The people who disappeared in Dead Man's Cove didn't die in the conventional sense. They became part of something else. Something that existed in the dark water and communicated in a language that human ears weren't meant to understand. I completed my thesis research using data from other locations, and I never returned to Dead Man's Cove. But I still have the video footage and audio recordings from my nights there, and sometimes I review them trying to understand what I witnessed. The voices in the recordings have a hypnotic quality that makes me want to go back to the water, to join the circle of people standing in the darkness, to learn their language and become part of whatever ancient ceremony they're conducting. The local fishermen were right to warn me about disturbing those waters at night. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some research is too dangerous to conduct. The alligators in Dead Man's Cove aren't just predators feeding on fish and small mammals. They're guardians of something much older and more mysterious. Something that collects people who venture too close to the truth and transforms them into permanent residents of the dark water. My advice to anyone conducting research in remote areas is to listen to the warnings of local people, even if their concerns seem superstitious or unscientific. Sometimes folklore and legend are the only ways that communities can pass down knowledge about dangers that science isn't equipped to understand or explain. And sometimes the most important discovery you can make is knowing when to stop looking and walk away. My grandmother used to say that every small town has one secret that everybody knows, but nobody talks about. I thought she was just being dramatic until the summer of 2018 when I moved back to help with her medical bills. That's when I learned what really happened at the monthly potluck dinners at Cornerstone Baptist Church, and why certain families never attended. I had been living in Austin for about 8 years, working as a mechanic at one of those quick change oil places. When my grandmother called me in June of 2018 and told me that her diabetes was getting worse and she needed help managing her medications, I knew I had to come back. She had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. So I packed up my belongings and drove back to Cedar Ridge, Texas, population 412. My grandmother lived in the same house where I had spent my teenage years, with a backyard that backed up to the cemetery behind the Baptist church. Within the first week, I realized that my grandmother's health problems were more serious than she had let on. But as she got better with my help, she started talking about the church potlucks. Cornerstone Baptist Church held a community potluck dinner on the first Sunday of every month. My grandmother had been attending these for over 30 years, but something had changed in recent years. She would say that the food tasted strange, or that people were acting differently, or that there were families attending who she didn't recognize. I offered to go with her to the next potluck to see what she was worried about. The potluck was scheduled for the first Sunday in July, and my grandmother spent the entire week preparing her famous cornbread dressing. The fellowship hall was crowded when we arrived, easily 60 people in a town of 400. My grandmother introduced me to several people that I remembered from my childhood, but there were also a lot of faces that I didn't recognize. When we sat down to eat, I immediately understood what my grandmother had been trying to tell me. My first bite of what was supposed to be macaroni and cheese had a flavor that I couldn't identify, something earthy and bitter, The green bean casserole had the same off taste, and the potato salad made my mouth feel numb. I looked around to see if other people were having the same reaction, but everyone else seemed to be eating normally and enjoying their meals. Even my grandmother was eating steadily, though I could see concentration on her face. That's when I noticed the families that weren't there. Growing up in Cedar Ridge, I had known most of the regular church families, but several of these families were missing. The Hendersons, the Rodriguezes, the Washingtons, the Kowalskis. When I asked my grandmother about this, she told me that these families had stopped coming to the potlucks about 2 years earlier. They still attended regular church services, but they always made excuses to leave before the monthly potluck dinners. I decided to introduce myself to some of the families that I didn't recognize. The first family I approached looked at each other with expressions that seemed almost panicked when I told them my name. They claimed to have been attending the church for years, but when I asked them where they lived or what brought them to Cedar Ridge, they gave vague answers that didn't make sense. The same thing happened with the next few families. They all claimed to be regular members, but none could give specific details about their lives in Cedar Ridge. When I asked one woman where her children went to school, she said they were homeschooled. When I asked a man what he did for work, he said he was retired. I started to feel like I was in some surreal dream where everyone was playing a role, but nobody could remember their lines. These people looked normal and acted friendly, but there was something hollow about their responses. On the drive home, my grandmother told me that she had been wondering about the same thing for months. More and more unfamiliar families had been showing up at the potlucks, but when she tried to get to know them better, they would always change the subject. She also told me something that made my blood run cold. She had started keeping track of the families who attended the potlucks, and she had noticed a pattern. Every few months, one of the regular Cedar Ridge families would stop coming to the potlucks, and shortly afterward, a new, unfamiliar family would start attending. Over the next few weeks, I started investigating. I went to the library and looked through old church directories and newspaper archives. What I found was disturbing. According to the records I could find, several of the families that claimed to be longtime members had never existed in Cedar Ridge. There were no birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, or any other official documents proving they had ever lived in the area. I also discovered something else frightening. When I looked through old newspaper obituaries, I found records for several Cedar Ridge families who had supposedly died in accidents over the past few years. But these were the same families that my grandmother said had simply stopped attending the potlucks. The Martinez family had reportedly died in a house fire 2 years earlier. But according to my grandmother, they hadn't died. They had just stopped coming to the potlucks. The Johnson family had supposedly died in a car accident, but my grandmother remembered them being alive and well. The more I researched, the more I realized there was a systematic cover-up happening. Families were disappearing, official records were being falsified to make it look like they had died, and new families were taking their places at the church potlucks. I confronted my grandmother with what I had discovered, and she broke down and told me the rest. She said that the food at the potlucks definitely contained something that affected people's memories and decision-making abilities. She had been forcing herself to eat as little as possible to try to dilute whatever drugs were being used. The most terrifying part was what she had discovered about Pastor Williams, the minister, who had been leading Cornerstone Baptist Church for the past 3 years. He had arrived shortly before the disappearances started. She had researched him and discovered that he had been the minister at churches in several other small towns, and in each case, there had been unexplained disappearances during his tenure. My grandmother believed that Pastor Williams was part of some organized group that targeted small, isolated communities where people could disappear without attracting outside attention. They would replace the missing families with their own people, gradually taking over the community from within. I wanted to go to the police, but my grandmother begged me not to. She pointed out that the local sheriff was a regular attendee at the church potlucks and was likely either part of the conspiracy or under the influence of whatever drugs were being used. Instead, we decided to leave Cedar Ridge as quietly as possible. I told my grandmother to pack only her most essential belongings, and we drove to Austin that same night without telling anyone we were leaving. My grandmother lived with me in Austin for the next 2 years until she passed away from complications related to her diabetes. She would have nightmares about church potlucks and wake up convinced that someone was trying to poison her food. After she died, I tried to find out what had happened to Cedar Ridge, but according to online records, the town no longer exists. The post office was closed, the school district was dissolved, and all the residents supposedly moved away to other communities. But I know that's not what really happened. I think Pastor Williams and his people finally completed their takeover of the town, and they erased it from official records to cover up their crimes. The real residents of Cedar Ridge are probably dead, and the people who replaced them have moved on to their next target. I still have nightmares about that last potluck dinner, and I can still taste that bitter, earthy flavor that was in all the food. Sometimes I wonder if my grandmother and I would have been the next ones to disappear if we had stayed any longer. The scariest part is realizing how easy it would be for this kind of thing to happen without anyone noticing. Small rural communities are isolated and self-contained, and people are used to families moving away for economic reasons. If the disappearances are gradual and the cover-up is thorough, who would ever investigate? My advice to anyone living in a small town is to pay attention to the people around you. If families start disappearing and being replaced by strangers who can't give you straight answers about their backgrounds, don't assume it's just a coincidence. And whatever you do, don't eat anything at church potluck dinners unless you're absolutely certain you know who prepared it. I was covering a 4th grade class in October 2021 when I found a student essay that made my blood run cold. The assignment was write about your family's traditions, and little Emma Richardson had written about helping her dad with the special harvest every fall. What she described wasn't corn or apples. I had been working as a substitute teacher in Millbrook, Oregon for about 6 months when this happened. Millbrook was one of those small farming communities where everybody knew everybody, and outsiders were treated with polite suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of trust. The kind of place where the biggest excitement was usually the annual harvest festival in late October, where local farmers would display their best produce and families would compete in pie baking contests. The regular 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had called in sick with what she said was a stomach bug, so I was covering her class for what I expected would be a routine day of math worksheets and reading comprehension exercises. But Mrs. Patterson had left instructions for the students to work on their family traditions essay, which was supposed to be part of a larger unit on community and heritage. Most of the essays were exactly what you would expect from 9- and 10-year-olds writing about their families. Tommy wrote about how his grandmother taught him to make apple butter every fall. Sarah described her family's tradition of camping at the coast every summer. Michael wrote about helping his father repair tractors and other farm equipment during the winter months when there was less field work to do. But Emma Richardson's essay was different. It was longer and more detailed than the others, written in the careful handwriting of a child who was trying very hard to get every word exactly right. And what she described made my hands shake as I read it. Emma wrote about how every October, when the regular harvest was finished and most of the other farming families were preparing for winter, her father would take her and her older brother out to what she called the back fields to help with a different kind of harvest. She described how they would work at night, using flashlights and lanterns because this special harvest could only be done in darkness. According to Emma, the back fields didn't grow the same crops as the rest of their farm. Instead of corn or wheat or vegetables, these fields grew what she called the tall ones and the quiet ones. She wrote that the tall ones looked like people but were much taller than any person she had ever seen, and they stood perfectly still in neat rows like regular crops. The quiet ones were smaller, about the size of children, and they were always sleeping with their eyes closed. Emma's essay explained that the special harvest involved carefully digging up the tall ones and the quiet ones and loading them onto trucks to be taken to what she called the delivery place. She wrote that her job was to help clean the dirt off of them and to make sure that none of them were damaged during the harvesting process. Her older brother's job was to help their father carry the heavier ones to the trucks. The most disturbing part of Emma's essay was her description of what happened to the tall ones and quiet ones after they were harvested. She wrote that some of them would be kept in the barn over the winter, where they would slowly wake up and start moving around. Others would be taken immediately to customers who lived in other towns and had placed special orders for specific types. Emma seemed to think that this was a completely normal family business, like raising cattle or growing vegetables for market. She wrote about how proud she was to be old enough to help with the special harvest, and how her father had told her that someday she would inherit the back fields and continue the family tradition. But the details in her essay made it clear that whatever the Richardsons were harvesting in their back fields, it wasn't anything that should be growing in the soil of rural Oregon. Emma described how the tall ones and quiet ones had to be handled very carefully because they would sometimes move or make sounds when they were being dug up, even though they were supposed to be sleeping. She wrote about how her father always carried a special tool that he would use to make sure they stayed quiet during the harvesting process. Most disturbing of all, Emma wrote about how the quiet ones looked just like the children from her school, and how she sometimes recognized faces of kids who had moved away from Millbrook in previous years. She seemed to think this was just a coincidence, and she wrote about how excited she would get when she found one that looked like someone she knew. After I finished reading Emma's essay, I sat at Mrs. Patterson's desk for several minutes trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to believe that Emma had just written a creative fiction story instead of following the assignment instructions. Maybe she had been reading too many scary books or watching too many horror movies and her imagination had gotten carried away. But there was something about the matter-of-fact way that Emma had written about these disturbing events that convinced me she was describing something she had actually experienced. The details were too specific and too consistent for a child to have made up, and there was no sense in her writing that she understood there was anything unusual or frightening about what she was describing. I decided to talk to Emma privately during recess to see if I could get a better understanding of what she had written about. When I asked her to explain more about her family's special harvest, she became very excited and started telling me additional details that hadn't been in her essay. Emma told me that the back fields had been in her family for generations, and that her great-grandfather had been the first Richardson to discover that these particular crops would grow there. She said that most people didn't know about the special harvest because it was a family secret, and that her father had made her promise never to talk about it with anyone outside the family. When I asked Emma what happened to the tall ones and quiet ones after they were harvested, she explained that they were sold to people who needed them for important work in other places. She said that her father never told her exactly what kind of work they were used for, but that it must be very important because the customers were willing to pay a lot of money for them. The most chilling moment of our conversation came when I asked Emma if she had ever seen any of the tall ones or quiet ones moving or acting like they were alive. She looked at me with the serious expression that children get when they're trying to explain something important to an adult who doesn't understand. Emma told me that of course they were alive, but that they were sleeping very deeply and wouldn't wake up completely until they reached their final destinations. She said that sometimes they would move a little bit or make soft sounds, but that this was normal and nothing to be worried about. She explained that her father had taught her how to tell the difference between the ones that were sleeping normally and the ones that might be having problems. After my conversation with Emma, I knew that I had to report what I had learned to someone in authority. But I also knew that if I was wrong about what Emma was describing, I could be ruining the reputation of a local farming family based on the imagination of a 9-year-old girl. I decided to call the Oregon State Police and speak to someone in their criminal investigation division. I explained that I was a substitute teacher and that I had concerns about possible child endangerment based on an essay written by one of my students. The detective I spoke to was initially skeptical, but when I read Emma's essay to him over the phone, he agreed that it warranted further investigation. 2 days later, I learned that the state police had obtained a search warrant for the Richardson farm and had conducted a thorough investigation of the property. What they found in the back fields confirmed my worst fears about what Emma had been describing in her essay. The Richardson family had been operating what law enforcement officials described as a human trafficking operation disguised as a farming business. The backfields contained dozens of makeshift graves where victims had been buried in shallow pits and kept in drug-induced comas until they could be transported to buyers in other states. Emma's father and older brother were arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, human trafficking, and murder. Emma and her mother were taken into protective custody, and Emma was placed in foster care with a family in a different part of the state. The investigation revealed that the Richardson operation had been active for at least 10 years, and that they had been responsible for the disappearances of dozens of people from small towns throughout Oregon and Northern California. The victims included both adults and children, and many of them matched the descriptions of people who had been reported missing from Millbrook and surrounding communities. Emma's essay had described something so horrific that my mind had initially refused to accept that it could be real. But her innocent, matter-of-fact account of helping her family with their special harvest had provided law enforcement with the evidence they needed to shut down a criminal operation that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The most heartbreaking part of this entire experience was realizing that Emma had been raised to believe that participating in these crimes was a normal family tradition. She had no understanding that what her father was doing was wrong, and she had been proud of her role in helping with the harvest. I never saw Emma again after she was placed in foster care, but I often think about her and hope that she has been able to get the help she needs to recover from the trauma of her childhood. I also think about how many other children might be living in situations where they are being taught to participate in criminal activities disguised as family traditions. The Richardson case taught me that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that sometimes the most innocent voices can reveal the darkest truths. As teachers, we have a responsibility to pay attention to what children tell us, even when their stories seem too disturbing to believe. The Hartwell-Lindbergh property dispute started in 1952 over 18 inches of farmland. By 2019, when both families hired me to settle it once and for all, that 18-inch strip had become a burial ground. What I found when I started measuring that contested boundary line will haunt me until the day I die. I had been working as a licensed land surveyor in rural Minnesota for about 15 years when the Hartwell and Lindbergh families contacted me about resolving their boundary dispute. These kinds of cases were pretty common in farming communities where property lines that had been established decades earlier sometimes became unclear due to missing markers, conflicting deeds, or changes in the landscape over time. What made this particular case unusual was the length of time that the dispute had been going on. According to the documents that both families provided me, The disagreement over the exact location of their shared property line had been ongoing for nearly 70 years. 3 generations of Hartwells and Lindberghs had been arguing over the same strip of land, and the animosity between the families had only gotten worse with each passing decade. The disputed area was a narrow strip of farmland approximately 18 inches wide and about 200 yards long, running along the border between the Hartwell farm to the north and the Lindbergh farm to the south. Both families claimed ownership of this strip, and both had documentation that seemed to support their claims. The Hartwells had a deed from 1951 that described their property as extending to the old stone fence line, which they claimed included the disputed strip. The Lindberghs had a survey from 1953 that showed their property extending to the natural drainage ditch, which they argued was located 18 inches north of where the Hartwells claimed it was. Over the years, both families had tried to resolve the dispute through various means. They had hired lawyers, consulted with other surveyors, and even attempted mediation through the County Agricultural Extension Office. But every attempt at resolution had failed, usually because one family or the other would refuse to accept the proposed solution. By 2019, the situation had reached a crisis point. The current generation of both families was getting older, and they wanted to settle the dispute before they passed the farms on to their children. Both sides were tired of the ongoing conflict, but neither was willing to give up what they believed was rightfully theirs. That's when they decided to hire me to conduct a comprehensive boundary survey using modern GPS technology and historical research to determine the exact location of the property line once and for all. Both families agreed that they would accept my findings as final and legally binding, regardless of which side the decision favored. I started my work by reviewing all of the historical documents related to both properties, including deeds, surveys, tax records, and aerial photographs dating back to the 1940s. I also researched the history of the area to understand how the land had been originally surveyed and divided when it was first settled. What I discovered during my research was that the property dispute was more complex than either family had realized. The original survey of the area had been conducted in 1894, but the surveyor's notes were incomplete and contained several inconsistencies. Additionally, both the old stone fence line and the natural drainage ditch mentioned in the competing deeds had been altered multiple times over the decades, making it difficult to determine their exact historical locations. The next phase of my work involved conducting a physical survey of the disputed area using GPS equipment and traditional surveying tools. This was where things started to get strange. When I began measuring the contested strip of land, I immediately noticed that the soil in that area was different from the surrounding farmland. Instead of the rich black topsoil that covered the rest of both farms, the disputed strip had lighter-colored sandy soil that seemed to have been disturbed relatively recently. I also noticed that nothing grew well in that strip. While the fields on both sides supported healthy crops of corn and soybeans, the vegetation in the disputed area was sparse and sickly looking. The few weeds and grasses that did manage to grow there were stunted and discolored, as if the soil was contaminated with something that inhibited plant growth. At first, I assumed that the poor soil quality was the result of decades of farming practices, or maybe the application of too much fertilizer or herbicide. But as I continued my survey work, I started to suspect that there might be something buried in that strip of land. My suspicions were confirmed when I used ground-penetrating radar to scan the area. The radar readings showed multiple large objects buried at depths ranging from 3 to 6 feet below the surface. The objects were roughly human-sized and were arranged in 2 neat rows running the entire length of the disputed strip. I immediately contacted both families to inform them of what I had found, and I recommended that we stop the survey work and contact law enforcement. but both the Hartwells and the Lindberghs insisted that I continue with the survey and not involve any outside authorities until we had determined the exact nature of what was buried there. Against my better judgment, I agreed to excavate one of the buried objects to see what we were dealing with. What we found made me wish I had called the police immediately. The first object we uncovered was a wooden coffin that appeared to have been buried sometime in the 1950s or early 1960s. Inside the coffin was the body of a man in his 30s or 40s wearing clothes that were consistent with the time period when the coffin was buried. The body was remarkably well preserved, probably due to the sandy soil conditions and the sealed environment inside the coffin. But what made this discovery truly disturbing was that the man had obviously died violently. His skull had been crushed, and there were multiple stab wounds visible in his clothing and the remains of his flesh. This was clearly a murder victim, not someone who had died of natural causes and been buried in a family cemetery. When I showed the body to representatives from both families, their reactions confirmed my worst fears about what we had discovered. Instead of being shocked or horrified by finding a murder victim buried on their property, both families seemed to recognize the deceased man and understand why he was there. Old Henrik Lindbergh, who was in his 80s and the patriarch of the Lindbergh family, looked at the body and said, "That's Bill Morrison. He was asking too many questions about what happened to his brother." Henrik's son nodded in agreement and added, "Dad always said that Bill should have minded his own business." From the Hartwell side, the reaction was similar. Martha Hartwell, who was Henrik's contemporary and the family matriarch, examined the body and said, "I remember when we buried him. It was right after the harvest in 1953. Her grandson asked if they should continue digging up the others, and Martha nodded and said, "Might as well finish what we started." Over the next few hours, we excavated 6 more bodies from the disputed strip. All of them showed signs of violent death, and all of them were recognized by members of both families as people who had supposedly left the area decades earlier, or who had simply disappeared without explanation. The families explained to me that the disputed property strip had been used as a burial ground for anyone who threatened to expose what they called the family business. Both the Hartwells and the Lindberghs had been involved in organized crime activities since the 1940s, including bootlegging during Prohibition, cattle rustling, and later drug trafficking. The reason that both families had claimed ownership of the burial strip was not because they wanted the land for farming, but because they each wanted to control access to the evidence of their crimes. The ongoing property dispute had been a way to ensure that no one else would ever develop or disturb that area. The most disturbing part of this revelation was learning that the violence had continued into recent years. The most recently buried body was that of a man named David Chen, who had disappeared in 2011 after asking too many questions about suspicious activities on the neighboring farms. Both families had participated in his murder and burial, just as they had with all the others. I immediately contacted the FBI and the Minnesota State Police to report what we had discovered. Within hours, both farms were swarming with federal agents and forensic investigators. The entire disputed strip was excavated, revealing a total of 14 bodies spanning nearly 60 years of criminal activity. Both families were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. The investigation revealed a criminal enterprise that had operated in the area for decades, with both families working together to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. The irony of the situation was that the property dispute that had brought me there in the first place had never been real. Both families had manufactured the boundary disagreement as a way to keep attention focused on the legal aspects of the land ownership rather than on what was actually buried there. My work as a land surveyor usually involves helping people resolve legitimate disputes over property boundaries and ownership rights. But in this case, I had been unknowingly hired to help 2 criminal families maintain control over their burial ground. The experience taught me that in rural communities, even the most ordinary-seeming property disputes can have dark underlying causes. Long-running conflicts between neighboring families sometimes involve much more than just disagreements over fence lines or drainage ditches. Since the Hartwell-Lindbergh case, I have been much more careful about accepting boundary dispute cases, especially ones involving families that have been in conflict for decades. I always conduct thorough background research on my clients and the properties involved, and I don't hesitate to contact law enforcement if I discover anything suspicious during my survey work. The disputed strip of land is now part of an ongoing federal investigation, and both farms have been seized as evidence in the criminal case. The families who hired me to resolve their property dispute are now serving life sentences in federal prison. Sometimes the boundaries that people fight over aren't just about land ownership. Sometimes they're about protecting secrets that are buried beneath the surface. Emergency dispatch gets weird calls during blizzards, but the call that came in during the January 2023 storm wasn't about being snowed in or power outages. Martha Olson from Township Road 15 was calling because her weather radio was broadcasting forecasts for places that don't exist, and the voice giving the reports belonged to her husband, who'd been dead for 6 years. I had been working as an emergency services dispatcher for McLean County for about 8 years when that call came in. Most of my experience was with typical rural emergencies, farm accidents, medical calls to isolated homes, and the occasional search and rescue when someone got lost during hunting season. Winter storms always brought their own set of challenges, mostly power outages and people getting stranded on back roads, but nothing that prepared me for what Martha Olson reported that night. The January 2023 blizzard was one of the worst storms to hit central North Dakota in decades. Wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, and snowfall so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. We had been fielding emergency calls for 3 straight days, mostly from people whose furnaces had failed or who needed medical assistance but couldn't get to the hospital due to impassable roads. Martha's call came in around 2 in the morning on the 3rd night of the storm. I recognized her voice immediately because she had called dispatch several times over the years, usually for minor medical issues related to her diabetes or to report suspicious vehicles on the rural roads near her farm. She was a reliable caller, the kind of person who only contacted emergency services when she genuinely needed help. But this call was different from anything I had ever received. Martha sounded frightened and confused, and she kept apologizing for bothering us during the storm. She explained that she had been listening to her weather radio to track the progress of the blizzard when it started broadcasting forecasts for locations that she had never heard of. Places with names like Coldwater Junction and White Rock Township and Millerville Crossing. At first, I assumed that her radio was picking up transmissions from a different state or maybe even Canada, which sometimes happened during severe weather when atmospheric conditions could cause radio signals to travel much farther than normal. I was about to explain this to Martha when she told me the part that made my blood run cold. Martha said that the voice giving the weather forecasts sounded exactly like her husband Harold, who had died of a heart attack in 2017. She insisted that it wasn't just a similar voice or someone who reminded her of Harold. She was absolutely certain that it was Harold's voice, complete with his distinctive accent and the way he pronounced certain words. I had met Harold Olson several times during my years as a dispatcher. He had been a volunteer with our emergency response team, helping with search and rescue operations and severe weather spotting. He had a very distinctive way of speaking with a slight Norwegian accent that reflected his family's heritage, and he always ended his radio transmissions with the phrase 73 and stay safe, which was ham radio code for best wishes. Martha told me that the voice on her weather radio was using Harold's exact speech patterns, and even ending each forecast with 73 and stay safe. She had been listening to the broadcasts for over an hour, and each forecast was for a different fictional location, but they were all delivered in Harold's unmistakable voice. I tried to calm Martha down and suggested that the storm might be causing her radio to malfunction or pick up unusual signals. But she insisted that the radio was working perfectly and that the forecasts were clear and detailed, just like regular National Weather Service broadcasts. She offered to hold the phone up to the radio so I could hear the transmissions myself. When Martha held her phone near the weather radio, I could clearly hear a male voice giving detailed weather forecasts. The voice was professional and authoritative, just like a trained meteorologist, but it was also somehow familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. The forecast was for a place called Deadwood Prairie, predicting continued blizzard conditions with wind gusts up to 80 miles per hour and snowfall accumulations of 18 to 24 inches. What made the broadcast truly disturbing was that it ended with the phrase 73 and stay safe, delivered in the exact tone and cadence that I remembered from Harold Olson's emergency radio transmissions. I had heard Harold use that sign-off dozens of times during my years as a dispatcher, and there was no mistaking his distinctive way of saying it. I told Martha that I would send a deputy to check on her as soon as the roads were passable, but she said that wasn't necessary. She just wanted someone to know what was happening in case something went wrong. She also asked me if I could check our records to see if there had ever been places called Coldwater Junction or White Rock Township in McLean County, because the weather reports were describing local landmarks and road conditions that seemed familiar even though the town names were completely unknown to her. After I finished the call with Martha, I spent the rest of my shift researching the place names that she had mentioned. I checked historical maps, county records, and even old telephone directories, but I couldn't find any reference to Coldwater Junction, White Rock Township, Millerville Crossing, or any of the other locations that had been mentioned in the weather forecasts. However, I did discover something that made the situation even more unsettling. When I looked at modern maps of McLean County and the surrounding area, I noticed that many of the geographic features mentioned in the fictional weather forecasts actually existed. There really was a Deadwood Prairie, though it was just an unnamed section of grassland about 20 miles north of Martha's farm. There were also several creeks, hills, and other landmarks that had been accurately described in the mysterious broadcasts. It was as if someone with detailed knowledge of the local geography was creating fictional towns and townships in real locations, then broadcasting weather forecasts for these imaginary communities using Harold Olson's voice and speech patterns. 2 days later, when the storm finally passed and the roads were cleared, I drove out to Martha's farm to check on her and to listen to her weather radio myself. Martha was relieved to see me, and she explained that the strange broadcasts had continued throughout the entire storm, always featuring different fictional locations, but always delivered in Harold's distinctive voice. She led me to her kitchen where she kept the weather radio, a standard National Weather Service receiver that was tuned to the local emergency broadcast frequency. When she turned it on, we could hear normal weather updates from the Bismarck office, with current conditions and forecasts for real cities and counties in the region. But Martha said that the mysterious broadcasts only occurred during severe weather events, and only late at night when most people would be asleep. She had been keeping a log of all the fictional place names and weather conditions that had been reported, and she showed me pages of notes written in her careful handwriting. The locations mentioned in the broadcasts formed a pattern that was both fascinating and disturbing. All of the fictional towns and townships were located in areas where real communities had existed decades earlier, but had been abandoned due to economic hardship or natural disasters. Coldwater Junction had been built on the site of a railroad town that was abandoned in the 1930s. White Rock Township corresponded to an area where several farming families had lived until the Dust Bowl forced them to relocate. It was as if the mysterious broadcaster was creating weather forecasts for ghost towns, communities that had once existed but were now just empty fields and forgotten foundations. And the person delivering these forecasts was using the voice of Harold Olson, a man who had spent his entire life in McLean County and would have known the history of every abandoned settlement in the area. Martha also told me something that she hadn't mentioned during her emergency call. She said that the weather forecasts weren't just describing current conditions. They were also including historical information about the fictional communities, mentioning families who had lived there, businesses that had operated, and events that had supposedly taken place decades earlier. Some of these historical details matched real information about the abandoned settlements that had once existed in those locations. The broadcasts would mention family names that appeared in old county records, or describe businesses that had actually operated in the ghost towns before they were abandoned. I contacted the National Weather Service office in Bismarck to report the unusual radio transmissions, but they had no record of any unauthorized broadcasts on their frequency. They suggested that Martha's radio might be malfunctioning or that she might be picking up transmissions from amateur radio operators who were using their equipment inappropriately. But I knew that wasn't the explanation. I had heard Harold Olson's voice too many times to mistake it for someone else, and the level of historical detail in the broadcasts suggested access to information that would be difficult for a prankster to obtain. Over the next year, Martha continued to receive the mysterious weather forecasts during severe storms. She called me several times to report new fictional locations and to share additional historical information that had been included in the broadcasts. Each time I verified that the places didn't exist on modern maps, but corresponded to areas where real communities had once thrived. The most disturbing call came in December 2023, almost a year after the first incident. Martha reported that the weather radio had broadcast a forecast for Olson's Corners, a fictional township located exactly where Harold Olson's family farm had been before it was sold after his death. The forecast had included detailed information about the Olson family history, mentioning Harold's parents and grandparents by name and describing events that had taken place on the farm over the past century. The broadcast had ended with Harold's voice saying, "This is your final forecast for Olson's Corners. The weather ahead is clear and calm. 73 and stay safe, Martha." Martha never received another mysterious weather broadcast after that night. Her radio returned to normal operation, receiving only official National Weather Service transmissions. But she told me that she still turns on the weather radio during every storm, hoping to hear Harold's voice one more time, delivering forecasts for places that exist only in memory and in the voices of the dead who refuse to let them be forgotten.